This is American Political Thought. This is the second module of the classes for March 8th through 12th, and this is, and we're exploring Storing's book, which is to say we're exploring the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. In this segment, I'm essentially going to, and you should have in front of you, of course, the notes, Storing's book, and the essential and critical comparogram, which I'm going to refer to and use to organize the bulk of this discussion. I just want to start out with a couple of quotes to reiterate and reinforce what I said on in our last lecture, laying out the introduction to the book, why study it, and why study the thought of the Anti-Federalists, why study the founding debate, and in what sense they were losers. Just to again to make that point. This is, by the way, from and you'll see again. Well, why listen to me when you can listen to the story? On page 71 from the first page of chapter 9. The Anti-Federalists lost the debate over the Constitution not merely because they were less clever arguers, although Storing does suggest that perhaps they weren't as organized or profound or deep. And when you had the lights on the other side, such as John Adams and Jefferson, by the way, who didn't oppose the Constitution, but was not quite an anti-federalist, but did oppose, certainly when the Constitution began to operate, opposed the Federalist understanding. Once Federalist didn't mean supporting the ratification of the Constitution, but after the ratification and the beginning of government under the Constitution, when Federalist meant expanding the scope and power of the national government under the new Constitution. And what happened to the Anti-Federalists, of course, as Storing points out, once the Constitution was ratified, they understood they lost. If they really didn't agree with the Constitution, they could always go to Canada, or even leave, and like the Loyalists in the Revolution, go back to Britain. But the Anti-Federalists, of course, the opposition to the Constitution, for fears that it would lead to consolidation of the states, that it would lead to a death, that it would lead to an increased and unstoppable, administratively voracious central government, and that ultimately that American liberty would be dissolved away, and that American citizenship would evaporate. The Anti-Federalist objections to the Constitution then became, within the framework of the new Constitution, the Republican Democratic Party. It shared both at the time. Opposition to the Federalist expansion of the national government under the Constitution. And in that sense, Jefferson, who wasn't even present in the country during the framing of the Constitution and its debate, he was our ambassador to France, which may have been providential, but he was a brilliant guy. But again, on the other side, of course, were James Madison and of course Alexander Hamilton, who probably were the greatest intellects in America at that time, at least with respect to political wisdom and political theory, and finance too, for that matter, certainly in terms of Hamilton. On page 71, when Storing says they lost the debate not just because they were less clever arguers or less skillful politicians, but because they had the weaker argument. And again, as we saw in the last lecture, that naturally leads to the question of then why study their thought. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because as you'll see, the basic answer is because the debate, they lost the debate, but they saw real problems with American life that the Constitution either ignored or can't take account of. And therefore, even though they lost the debate that they are engaged in is still going on. And of course, that's the main argument, and that's why we're spending much time on this. The debate of the founding is actually not over. And we'll see how that works out, not only in terms of Storing's profound and thoughtful last chapter, when he quotes from one of the greatest of the Anti-Federalists, as he says, not a bitter or partisan one, but a profound one, Mercy Warren, one of our female political theorists at the beginning of the Republic. Let's explore the weakness part a little bit, though. They were, as Publius said, trying to reconcile contradictions. This is from page 71 still. There was no possibility of instituting the small republic in the United States, and the Anti-Federalists themselves were not willing to pay the price that such an attempt would have required. So when you have the weaker argument, you might be in debate class, or you might take a speech class where you have to learn to argue positions you don't believe in, and you'll quickly discover there are such things as weaker and stronger arguments, not just louder and more obnoxious people. As we'll see, he will, as we lay out their thought, especially their differences from the Federalists, we'll see why the Federalists and the advocates of the Constitution, who grasped the possibility for great American national leadership and existence on the continental level. But let's turn then, and this is what we'll explore today primarily. This is on page 5 from the introduction from chapter 1. If the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were divided among themselves, they were, at a deeper level, united with one another. Their disagreements were not based on different premises about the nature or the ends of nature of man, or the nature or the ends of political life. And that's what we'll see, by the way. Of course, remember, both of these sets of partisans contesting for the nature of American government fought in the Revolution. That common ground, that statement about the nature of man, of course, is and that's what we saw earlier this week, or last week, in the Declaration of Independence. Again, both of these contestants subscribe to the principles of the Declaration, and what I want to do today in the lecture is spell out what that agreement meant. What exactly did they agree on? Or the ends of political life? Because the Declaration in that first paragraph also contains a statement about the purposes of political life, the securing of rights. Again, and we'll see that their agreement about that was extensive. We'll also see that there was another layer of agreement just besides the agreement on the fundamental nature of human beings as portrayed in the Declaration, or the ends of politics as portrayed in the Declaration. But the Declaration does not speak about, but which, nevertheless, this third layer of agreement did unite them too, and as you'll see, and that was the advantages of Republican government as the best form of government. As you're going to see, it's not that one advocated a different kind of government with respect to polity or regime, as we've seen, like, for instance, monarchy or aristocracy, no matter what Hamilton's detractors accused him of being a sycophant of the British monarchy. That was not true. Hamilton was a Republican. But as you'll see, the differences have to do with the kind of Republican government that they advocated and thought America needed. So, to continue with the quote from page 5, they were not the deep cleavages of contending regimes. They were much less sharp and clear-cut differences within the family, as it were, of men agreed that the purpose of government is the regulation and thereby the protection of individual rights, and that the best instrument for this purpose is some form of limited republican government. And that last one, of course, is the third layer of agreement that I talked about, and that is essentially represented, by the way, in the second column of the comparogram. Just to finish this nice quote, it is their common ground that explains, to a large extent, the relatively unclear line between the two camps and the diversity within each of them. This is not to say that the differences are negligible, as those would argue who claim that there is no basic political controversy or political theorizing in the United States. The differences are limited, but they are nevertheless substantial and well-formed. The nation was born in consensus, but it lives in controversy. and the main lines of that controversy are well-worn paths leading back to the founding debate. And as you're going to see, in the same way that Cropsey thinks that you can see the unfolding, you can see a path, you can see a wholeness in the nature of American politics, a coherence, and you can see a pattern to the unfolding. Storing also argues that that you can do the same thing, not so much looking to the larger pattern of a modern political philosophy that spawned and directs the American regime, but rather in the original argument between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So, if you're looking at the comparogram, again, and this will essentially take us up on the notes up through the end of Roman numeral 3, which I didn't quite get to in the previous module. And then in the last module in this segment, we'll finish with the notes and Storing's book, and we'll see their core differences with respect to the vision of Republican government. So if you're looking at the comparogram, here are the, and we'll go down the first column. There are essentially 4 areas of agreement between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Again, going back to the Declaration, in some ways, the first 2 are areas of agreement that spawn from the Declaration, that come out of the Declaration. So, what's the first thing they agreed on, because they agreed on the Declaration of Independence? That, and the way this first column I define is, if I may read from my adequate words, they agreed that there are certain permanent dangers and problems in political life, that there's no way to configure political life without these dangers or constant threats present, or shared assumptions about human beings and government from the Declaration, the first 2 things that Storing mentions in the passage that we read. So let's then work through that, especially kind of starting with the stuff in the Declaration. The first thing is, the Declaration, remember, says that by nature, that we are constructed by nature. And that means the Declaration affirms that there's something like nature, an order to the visible cosmos that we inhabit, which provides information and guidance for us about who and what we are in the cosmos and in the universe. And if you've had modern political philosophy, or even ancient political philosophy, this is in some ways the whole premise of political philosophy, that politics is at least so far as we can see, a pretty stable element of the human condition, and that nature, or reflection on our human nature, can guide us in the proper construction of politics. That's Frozen, who is not my cat. Let me pause here and see what this guest to my house needs. Just a second. She wanted to be let out. And even though I have a cat door, which she lets herself in and out at her will, sometimes, I guess like all of us, she just likes a little special extra attention, and so she wanted me to open the door for her and let her out. Bless her heart. All right. So even amidst the controversies of our day, say over sexuality or transgenderism, which would seem to imply a severing of the conduct of social or political policy from nature, still today the partisans in our politics still appeal to some version of nature as a guide to helping us construct politics properly, or address properly the nature of the issues. So remember, the Declaration, in justifying our revolution from Britain, forces our gaze back to the pre-political nature of human beings. And what do we learn, of course, from that second paragraph? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, all Americans at the founding agreed that by nature we are roughly equal to each other, and as we'll see, and have already seen, the meaning of equality is what Americans debate about. But we also all agree that nature makes us essentially free. And that means, among other things, that we are constructed by nature so that there is no clear principle of dominance or rule of one adult human being over another. Hence, we have no natural rulers, and that is why government is not a natural thing, because in creatures that have no natural rulers, they don't have people ruling them. That's what nature literally means. And that government, of course, as we'll see, is constructed, and like other instruments of artificial construction, it is constructed with certain purposes, which we'll turn to in a minute. So that means this: human nature requires, it has freedom built into it as an inalienable right, and requires freedom, and that to go back to the tension I just mentioned. And that, but yet, because of that lack of natural rule, the lack of society, the lack of political rule, a lack of a common authority, human nature also gets away with us, and we start invading each other's rights, and life becomes like a jungle. And therefore, as Hobbes suggests, and Locke and all the other modern theorists suggested that we've talked about, that natural condition of no common ruler must end if human beings are to live, and to live, of course, in peace together. But then you're left with a kind of tension, a tension that's inherent in these principles. That tension, again, is you've got to construct the authority, the power that government wields out of something. After all, everything is made out of something. And where is the something? What's the something that constitutes the stuff, the power, out of the material out of which governmental power is constructed? And of course, that is from our originally, naturally unlimited freedom and power over ourselves. We have to take some of that natural freedom and power and give it up to a common authority. That's where government, legitimately by consent, not by terror or by domination, but by the consent of the governed. That's why consent is such an important doctrine of legitimacy in modern political theory. And again, here's the point then. Here's the tension. In order to preserve our freedom, we have to give up some of our freedom. And as I talk about in my American government class in constitutional law, where we examine the tensions between individual liberty and the needs of society, there's no clear point at which you can say, here's the proper, well, no, there is a proper amount of freedom to be given up. But what I want to make you see here about this tension and about the common area of agreement between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists is we give up freedom in order to retain our freedom. The whole point of society is to create, yes, a new condition among the human beings called government and society, which means now limited freedom. But that giving up of freedom can't destroy the freedom, or else we've created an artificial instrument for our preservation, government, which actually destroys our nature. So you're really left with this very paradoxical embrace of the purpose of government as the securing of rights. That means, again, that the purpose of government and the measure of government succeeding is if in giving up your freedom, you nevertheless have retained most of your freedom. And so that's the first layer of government, of agreement between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And they also agreed, by the way, that if government becomes unlimited, then that governmental power then begins to eat up and destroy its original source of freedom in human nature. So this means that in limiting our freedom to create government, we have to create the instrument of government in such a way, again, that so it doesn't destroy our freedom, which means it's what we talked about earlier when we talked about limited government. God has absolute power, and the creators of the principles of modern political philosophy and the American founders thought that the government becomes worst, called tyranny. That's what happens, the ultimate deformation of government, when human beings forget that they are not gods and they think that they can obtain absolute rule over other human beings, which typically doesn't end well, as we know from the 20th and 21st centuries. Second, and we're going down the column on the paragraph, the passionate underpinning of human consciousness that undermines reason and makes for self-interest as the main human motivation related to the next, as you'll see. So this is both an amplification or an elaboration of the first layer of agreement, that nature makes us free, and yet we need government to keep that, to secure that freedom. Why then does nature create us needing freedom, but why does nature then put us in a condition where that freedom is insecure? It's because of the very construction of human consciousness. We are animals, and some of us more than others, but all of us, going back to Aristotle, the Bible, where human beings are part of created nature, but they're created in the image of God, but they're not God, but they're not also Mr. Ed, the talking horse. Well, if you're the department chair of the History and Politics Department, then you are talking horses at, no, I'm sorry, I wasn't even going to say it. Anyway, so the problem with human nature is human nature. We are composed of elements that derive from our animal bodies and our animal needs. And like any other animal, and all political philosophers and theologians admit that our bodies, which are what tend to put us in collision with others, sometimes in combination with others, our bodies generate these phenomena called passions, which are the marker and measure of our natural needs. We want the things that nature makes us need. And passion, emotion, craving, if you will, natural craving, like all animals have passions for the things, all animals have passions for the things they need. And so with human beings, there's this other layer, and the extent to which this other layer, let us call mind or reason, is actually rooted in our natural construction is a great source of controversy within modern philosophy. But let's just kind of set that aside and admit that at least something like reason exists in human beings that doesn't exist in other animals, and it's that very existence of the non-passionate element. Yes, I guess even frogs have to debate about which fly to eat, and cats certainly know how to order what they want on a menu and make their human landlords open the door for them whenever they want, so they must be thinking about it. But it's clear that only human beings have this level of self-consciousness and rationality that we call reason. Everybody understands there's some difference between human beings and animals, or that we're a special kind of animal with a unique kind of power. Whether it's Aristotle argues that that's the capacity to see ourselves in universal reason in the universe, or a certain calculative capacity, as Hobbes and Locke would suggest. One way or the other, the problem is that when push comes to shove in the needs of life, passion tends to override our reason. And therefore, especially for human beings living in society, under government, the problem is creating an environment that encourages human beings to aspire to some kind of rationality. That's the only way that they can see the common good, for instance. But again, you have to admit there's a kind of tragic tension here, because our passionate underpinnings make us want the things that we need, regardless of somebody else needs it, and that's why the human existence without government becomes so chaotic. The third thing, and you'll see this is a further amplification of the second one, and that is once you create government, and that means power, even if it's legitimate power of some people over other human beings, then you now create a new kind of passionate need that doesn't exist, although Hobbes did say it existed in Leviathan, and that's the desire to have power over others. Now, the reason you want to have power is because power helps you get the things you want, as Hobbes points out, but everyone knows this. So here's the point. Not everyone has the same passions, as we all know, and when it comes then, once government exists, and therefore there's this new kind of passion, this love of power, which the founding generation tended to label as ambition. That's what ambition for the founding generation, I think probably this generally means, although ambition today, I suppose, is a diffuse term that means your willingness to get up and get the things you want. But self-motivation almost. But ambition in the founding, since of course the context was the political founding of the United States, ambition meant the love of power. And as going back to Machiavelli, or even Aristotle and Plato, but especially Machiavelli and his followers, the ambitious, there's a special class of human beings who actually, once government exists, aspire to rulership. Maybe the rest of us just essentially want to be left alone, and we want government to protect us so that our neighbors don't come in and steal our televisions when we're not looking. But here's the problem. This third one is the source of the need for as Madison says in Federalist 51, this third thing, the ambition of the ambitious, the self-interest of rulers that can become tyrannical. And this is, again, this is not a course in modern political philosophy, but since Cropsey raised the question, and even though probably most political theories and most thinkers, intellectuals, think when it comes to brightness, Madison takes a second class to Marx because Marx was and is so influential. He's a major political philosopher in the modern world, and Marxism is a major approach to human life that certainly dominated 2/3 of the globe for most of the globe for the 20th century, and certainly has an appeal to many thinking people. So if you said, well, who's smarter, Madison or Marx? There would be like no contest. Madison was essentially a politician who wrote. And Marx was a philosopher who thought and created whole systems of thought. There's some truth to that, of course. But on this question, you have to decide. It's that, at least I have to say, after studying these things for 500 years, I think in this respect, Madison was, and the American framers were smarter than Marx. Marx really believed that you could configure human life through the communalization of productive property, if I may speak Marxism in a single sentence. Through the communalization of private property, you could eliminate tension among human beings, that you can actually create a kind of a new human being through communism that will be free of self-interested passions. And as Marx suggests in the German Ideology of 1833, that if you construct society properly, which is primarily means economy properly, you'll eliminate the actual conflict of self-interest that capitalism and most historical economies have encouraged, because of course Marx says all human societies, historical, have been class-based and dominant, with one class, usually the wealthy, and however you call them in every society, exploiting the poor. Okay. But again, Marx then says, and this is why I'm going on about this, Marx says, okay, but you can construct social and economic life so that all those passions that you think are embedded in human nature will be gradually sloughed off as humans adjust to a scientifically engineered, superabundant, communalized society, and that means class tensions will disappear, and the possibility for tyranny will disappear. One of the things you'll see, because Storing does such a good job of articulating both the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist thought, is both of these individuals said no. That's just, I don't care how smart Marx is or how many A's he got in German philosophy at the foot of Hegel. Human beings are human beings, and you're never going to have a configuration. And by the way, if you think you can configure society and politics so as to eliminate tragic tensions in human beings and class conflict and self-interest among human beings, you're fooling yourself, and you're going to create something much more horrible than anything that's ever existed. And I think, by the way, that prediction came true in the 20th century. Setting that editorial comment aside, the point I'm making here is both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists assume you could never have a political society or a set of institutions which eliminated or solved this tendency to tyrannical domination on the part of some human beings over others. So it's not a question of arranging society to get rid of that. Rather, the aim is to arrange political institutions so as to contain and manage that energy. And then the last thing that they agreed on, again, a set of problems that, if you think about it, this fourth thing stems from, in some ways, all the prior three, but especially the first one. And that is the eventual decay of free government and the dissolution of attachment to the common good. This is a complicated issue, but both, as you'll see, and it may be this fourth thing that actually really is more present in anti-federalist thought. The suggestion is, in the founding of a country and the emergency of revolution and throwing off tyranny, or like, for instance, extraordinary circumstances like World War II, or even natural disaster, setting aside looting and that kind of stuff. The argument is, in times of crisis, the essentials of human life come to the fore, and people are aware of what needs to be done. And people talk, for instance, nostalgically about World War II when everyone pulled together. Tom Brokaw, who wrote the series Band of Brothers, and many of your grandparents or my parents would reflect on how everyone pulled together, or after 9/11. Well, okay, the founding of a country is one of those moments of clarity when everyone seems to understand that everything's at stake, and therefore they come together to create the institutions and then set society on its way. And as we saw in the Cropsey article, or in general, we, in our regime, we try to preserve that moment in a written document, in a fundamental constitutional document that kind of freezes that original awareness, so that in subsequent generations people can look back to it and say, oh yes, that's the problem of human nature and government. And moreover, in those times, people are more willing to kind of pull together and help each other out. The common good seems almost to be an instinctive state of consciousness rather than even an abstract idea. But the problem is, and both Federalists and Anti-Federalists admitted this, even if you manage to set up and found the best possible imaginable government, it's still going to decay. Everything decays in life, and no regime is permanent. Although some can last very long. Supposedly, Egypt lasted for 3,000 years, and the Chinese empires lasted, although it's a debate about whether they were continuous, the different dynasties were the same thing. But a regime can last for a long time. England has lasted already for over 1,000 years. Rome lasted for 1,000 years, although it went through a profound regime change right in the middle, when it went from an imperial republic to an imperial imperium. So, all right, so we've been around for 250 years, but we're not going to be around forever. All things collapse and die. And one way to talk about this fourth level of agreement is kind of Aristotelian, and you'll see de Tocquevillian. If all things die and fall apart and decay in this universe, then there's a principle of decay, like human mortality, like my mother of blessed memory, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago, nevertheless lived to be 90 years old. And the point is, when you get up to 90, or 92 as my stepfather, or 100 as the mother of one of my good friends here in the Jewish community, you have fewer years ahead of you than you have behind you. And that's because the human body eventually wears out and decays. Now, who knows? Modern science may be find ways of preserving our youth, and therefore the physical immortality that Descartes promised, which we talked briefly about in the Cropsey article. That's one of the promises of modern science. Maybe that'll happen, but probably you and I, the people are alive, the one recording this video and the ones listening to it, or one listening to it, however many are out there listening to it, you and I have a mortal term in this life, and before we get there, unless we're killed by accident or disease, you're going to watch, as I've watched steadily for the last several decades, the decay of my body and the falling apart of the physical system that contains my loud mouth. But having said that, and Aristotle, de Tocqueville, and all political writers take that insight about universal decay and morality and apply it to politics. Therefore, no regime will ever last forever. And every regime has within it its own principle of dissolution, decay, and eventually even self-destruction, unless you're hit by an asteroid from space. which has a tendency to put all arguments to rest. But this is critical, and so if you're founding a society, you have to try to construct in its institutions something that preserves the nature of that regime as much as possible. And since the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, as we'll see in the next column, were convinced that Republican government, where the popular will, directly or indirectly, leads the policy of the government, where the government is founded in popular will and operates by a constant sampling of popular will called elections, that's the best form of government because it's the one most likely to keep government attentive to and aimed at its original purposes. But even then, you have to admit that even Republican government may have tendencies within it which eventually cause people to forget what it's all about and to lapse into their individual ways and lose concern of and awareness of the common good, and etc. So there you have it, that first column of the comparogram, and rooted in the Declaration. This is the consensus that Storing is talking about, that both Federalists and Anti-Federalists shared. Now, let's move to the second column, because this is, remember, Storing says they were united in their understanding of the nature of man, which we've just talked about, the end and purpose of government, and then also you could say the dangers, the permanent dangers posed by political society. Again, and if I may just reinforce the fourth one, you have to see that the founding of a country is sort of like a sound or something that makes a big bang. After the initial moment and everything, and as you move further away from the initial cause of the Big Bang, the memory of that Big Bang gets weaker and weaker, and therefore the original consensus and awareness of the common good and detachment and attachment to free government that led people to form a free and republican government, the very memory of that moment is what is the source of the decay and rot and potential rot in Republican government. So you can already hear, by the way, kind of what part of the solution is, and that is to try to preserve in the way the government operates some echo or memory that reminds subsequent generations of the nature of the original purpose of government and the original moment where government is formed, where we have the maximum of liberty and the maximum of attention to the common good. In fact, that's not a bad definition of a kind of definition of Republican government, is where the people are both in their personal lives and in their collective lives free, and therefore their personal lives are at their maximum amount of freedom, not the maximum amount before government, because again that's unsustainable, but in that initial moment when government's created, they're also they're freely devoted and actively involved in the common good. So you have this kind of a maximal combination of personal freedom and civil freedom and attention to the common good. If you can construct a Republican government so that it preserves that moment of awareness throughout the subsequent generations and in the operation of the government, you're likely to create a republic that will last longer than otherwise, before it's either replaced by some kind of tyranny or whatever replaces Republican government. We'll be examining that. So the second column then is the nature of human beings, human nature, the purpose and potential negative tendencies of government, and now the third level, why they were both advocates of Republican government. What's the big thing about Republican government? And let me direct you to page 16 in the Storing book. Now he's summarizing, and this is in chapter 3, The Small Republic. This is the first coherent presentation of anti-federalist thought, but on page 16, and this is what has guided my construction of the comparogram, he lays out why the anti-federalists advocated Republican government as the best solution to these four problems that we just articulated. But again, these three these four things actually are what both of them shared. So let me just read it, and you'll see that's what guides the construction of my thing, my columns, and the rows. Behind the administrative defects of a large republic lie three fundamental considerations bearing on the kind of government needed in a free society. Only a small republic can enjoy a voluntary attachment of the people to the government and a voluntary obedience to the laws. I'll elaborate in a minute as we go down the thing. Only a small republic can secure a genuine responsibility of the government to the people. And only a small republic can form the kind of citizens who will maintain Republican government. These claims are central to the Anti-Federalist position. And as you're going to see, they're also central to the Federalist position, who gave different answers to these. So let's go down the column, and we'll finish up with this segment. So the solution, insofar as there's a solution to the problems that we talked about in the first column, or the advantages presented by Republican government, as opposed to a monarchy, or an aristocracy, or an oligarchy, or whatever. So the first is voluntary consent not only is the origination of government, but is the operating mechanism of Republican government. It's not like, for instance, the people suddenly decide to consent to an absolute monarchy and say, okay, you run things and we'll just kind of take it. We'll just kind of pay attention to what's on our television screens and what's in our refrigerators. But no, the advantage of Republican government is it's like an operational preservation of certain elements of the state of nature, where we were both free and equal. And remember, legitimate government has to arise from the consent. It can't be imposed by terror on you, the way your parents did when you were 4 years old and made you clean up your room, those tyrants. You have to, again, what Republican government does is take that original moment of consent. And why is consent legitimate and terror or imposition or domination isn't? Because if nature makes us free and you consent to something, you may, for instance, create limitations on your freedom, but they come from your own freedom. So the reason consent is the basis of legitimate government is because it doesn't destroy your human nature as a free being. You consent to the imposition of government and the limitations of your own freedom. Therefore, you don't destroy your own freedom. You limit it, but you don't destroy it. And Republican government, as a form of government, if that's what you choose in that federal moment, then Republican government constantly goes back to the people and asks their direction, either through elections or directly like a democracy. So that original moment of consent is preserved in the day-to-day operation of the government. So, and generally speaking, if you can get somebody to do something through voluntary consent and persuasion, that's better than holding a gun to their head or to their families' heads and doing it through terror. The second thing is the rule of law. Republican government almost means the rule of law. And if you have rule of law, and we saw that's one of the reasons for the written Constitution, because it seems to establish that original moment of forming or founding as a permanent law. And why is law better than, say, other things? Well, let me read it, and then so this is the second thing that they agreed on the value of the rule of law as the basis of civil life, of basis of ongoing government, which forces power wielders to ground their governance in a general or legal framework beyond their passions of whim and self-interest, and puts real limits on what rulers can and cannot do. So as we're going to see, not only does law, which is a general principle found out by reason, that's Locke's definition of what a law is. A law is a general principle. And remember, general principles are only evident to our minds, like mathematics, only through the operation of reason. That's part of that conflicted nature of human nature that we talked about a minute ago. So law, if you have a republic, so the advantages is that the thing that government authority rests on is legal and not reducible to the power or whim or charisma of a powerful leader. So rule of law not only is a better expression of the common good of society because it's a general principle. Now, of course, a law can be imposed on someone. I mean, the Nuremberg laws in 1934 were, well, it's hard to say that. You could say that maybe those were consented to the majority of German citizens. We won't go into that. But the main thing is that if you force the people that hold power to operate through legal means, that's a way of forcing rule over you to be more rational and limited. Remember, we want limited government. We don't want absolute tyrannical government where human beings become gods, which almost never happens. So how do you prevent that? By forcing the people that hold power to wield it within a legal framework. A legal framework, by the way, which is understood and agreed to by the people who occupy that society. And then the third advantage is of course, if you have elections every 200 years, because the lifespan of a human being is about 60 to 120 years, then eventually law will become sort of detached from the ongoing collective voluntary will of the society. So the mechanism by which Republican government works is elections, and that means if you get a job and you come up for periodical evaluation and review, that gives your employer the opportunity to see how you're doing and to check up and to hold you to the purposes that you were employed. And the same way with government. As opposed to a hereditary monarchy, who you might like, Queen Elizabeth. Obviously not everybody does in Britain. But you could say this, if Queen Elizabeth had a term and had to run for re-election, then that makes those people wielding power give an account of how they've used their power. And if they're going to stay in power, they have to get the voluntary assent and agreement of those over whom they govern. So not only is it rule of law, which is the best framework for a government, but also periodic elections keep those in power, keep their feet to the fire, so to speak, by having them come back to the governed for continued permission to retain their power. And then the last level of agreement has to do with this great character of this great issue of character. Citizen character, the formation of citizens who value freedom, who understand the demands of freedom, and ultimately who can pay attention to the common good. Most of us, you could say, well, I don't need to be taught to love my own freedom. I like doing what I do, and so bug off. Just get lost if you're going to tell me what to do, unless you're a department chair or whatever. But believe me, I try to get students to buy the books I want them to buy every semester, and they obviously see this as a limitation on their personal freedom, and I'm not going to do it, so there. Anyway, yet, if you've had children, and I haven't, but I've had cats, which comes close. That was from Cats. All right. So if you're a parent and you raise children, you just don't want trained robots. You actually see that the main task of your job as parent isn't just to feed those buggers and then lock them in the closet so you can watch The Tonight Show without unimpeded. Or to send them to school so you don't have to worry about them. Yes, you have to feed and clothe your children. Let's just say it's a minimal thing. You have to take care of them. But all good parents will admit that the task of parenthood is the shaping of the character of your children, not just providing for their material needs, because you can beat them, you can feed them and beat them, as many parents do, unfortunately. Or you can be terrible parents who don't love their children and teach their children to be cringing ninnies. Or monstrous human beings that have no taste for being nice to other people. And most of us would admit that social life doesn't work very well, where people don't have the character or the taste of being nice to each other or caring about the common environment that they live in. Littering, for instance. When I was in the 60s, Lady Bird, Lyndon Bird's First Lady, ran the, Keep America Beautiful, because evidently litter was a real problem in America. Well, what does somebody who litters does? They could give a damn about the cleanliness of the public space. They just throw their stuff out the window or out the door. And so in some ways, you want to create a nation of non-litterers. Those people that possess the character and attentiveness, not only to be attached to their own freedom, and by the way, look how much people in Hong Kong are attached to their own freedoms at the very time when the people that run the People's Republic are clamping down on them and taking their freedom away. you have to get people who are attached to their freedom, or else they'll be willing passively to yield it up to talented and bullying governments. But it isn't just that. It's two things that you want to get people who live in a republic to have: a character, a certain set of virtues, character excellences that attach them to a free way of life, but a responsible way of life. So again, we'll end here. But what we've done is walk through the layer of consensus that all Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed on. And in the concluding module for this week, we will then explore their differences. Why the Anti-Federalists became convinced that the only way to have those four goods of Republican government that I just mentioned and walked through, and that Storing articulates, why you need that can only be in a geographically and demographically small republic. And why the Anti-Federalists argued that not only could you have it, but the great diverse national interest of commercial and political self-interest that the Constitution rests upon, as we'll explore, why that's the better template for a Republican form of government and society.